So just a few days ago, I talked about yet another study that shows the gender pay gap, this time in the bus and train operator industry in Massachusetts, was down to the different choices that men and women make in the workplace. Sadly, our political establishment here in Australia are completely and utterly clueless on this issue, or perhaps they do understand it but just try to exploit it to score political points. Now, for those not familiar with Australian politics, our current right-of-centre government is about to have their asses handed to them, largely because of their own stupidity, by the left-wing Labor Party at our next federal election to be held sometime in the first half of 2019. And so this week at the Labor Party National Conference in Adelaide, Labor leaders have been talking up all the ways they're going to spend/waste our tax dollars when they get into government. And one of their talking points is the gender wage gap. Here is our next Prime Minister, and probably the most disingenuous, full of shit Labor Party leader in Australian history, with the possible exception of Kevin Rudd, Bill Shorten.
And delegates, every time we talk about fair pay, this includes equal pay for the women of Australia. Chloe and I don't want our daughters growing up in an Australia where the gender pay gap means that they effectively work the first 2 months of the year for free compared to their male counterparts. This is Labor's promise. No more pay discounts because you're a woman. That's Labor's promise. We will strive from the first day of an election for pay equity for feminised industries, including but not limited to aged care workers, early educators and paid carers for the Australians we're counting on to deliver the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Now, although this is a national conference attended by mindless sheep that are expected to whoop and applaud the bullshit spoon-fed to them, there are actually people that believe women don't receive equal pay. The idea women are effectively working for the first 2 months for free is complete nonsense, of course. Again, it's a result of not understanding what the pay gap actually represents. The Workplace Gender Equality Agency, whose staff is more than 80% female, tells us that the gender pay gap in Australia is 14.6%. That's why Shorten says women have to effectively work 2 months of the year for free, because 2 months is about 16.6% of the year. Interestingly, if you scroll down the WGEA's graphic, you find that the gender pay gap is the difference between women's and men's average weekly full-time equivalent earnings, expressed as a percentage of men's earnings. It is a measure of women's overall position in the paid workforce and does not compare like roles. Now note down in the footnotes of this WGEA piece a reference to the ABS 2018 Average Weekly Earnings Report of May 2018. You see, the WGEA doesn't actually calculate this number. It comes straight from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And on the relevant ABS release, there is a link called A Guide to Understanding Average Weekly Earnings Statistics. And in that guide, there is a section titled Factors to Consider When Using Average Weekly Earnings Data. And under 1, comparing average earning estimates between groups of employees, quote, comparisons of average earnings, males and females. AWE statistics show a difference in average earnings between males and females. This is at least in part due to compositional factors that impact on earnings and are not adjusted for in the AWE series, such as employee characteristics such as age, experience and training, hours worked, employment conditions and occupation. Now, I know most of you watching understand this already, but I want to demonstrate how a government department using your tax dollars deliberately misrepresents basic facts. So the WGEA uses the ABS statistics, but here's what they say accounts for the earnings gap. So that's a very different picture than the factors given by the government agency that actually does the calculation. Note, discrimination is listed as the first factor, even though in any serious study on the topic, there is no evidence that discrimination plays any significant role, if any at all. But the important factor listed here by the WGEA, and which is now subsequently being run with by the ALP, is the second one. More specifically, the claim that female-dominated industries and jobs attract lower wages. Now again, there's no evidence for this, it's just a case of truth by assertion. They point at some industries that are low paid, notice that they are majority female, and conclude the reason those jobs are paid less is because they are majority female. Or put another way, this is a classic case of conflating correlation with causation. But this is what the Labor Party's policy comes down to. They're going to push for wage rises in industries that are low paid and majority female. This article in The Australian outlines the policy. In a win for unions, Labor has promised to strengthen the ability of the Fair Work Commission to award pay rises by making gender pay equity an object of the Fair Work Act. Now remember, when you see the word equity, it is synonymous with equality of outcome. Under the proposed changes, unions and workers will no longer require a male comparator to establish claims for pay rises in undervalued feminised industries. Labor will legislate a statutory equal remuneration principle to guide the Commission's consideration of whether feminised industries are paid fairly. It would also set up a pay equity panel within the Commission, led by a new presidential member, and a pay equity unit to provide expert research on equal remuneration. Oh, and I'm sure that advocacy research produced by the expert panel won't be biased in any way. Labor Deputy Leader Tanya Plibersek and Opposition Workplace Relations spokesman Brendan O'Connor said low-paid workers should not have to rely on fighting complex, expensive legal cases to secure a decent wage rise. We don't need to compare female-dominated jobs with male-dominated jobs to know that female-dominated industries are often poorly paid. That's just a fact. Whether it's a fact or not is beside the point. The question is why those jobs are paid less. And there's no evidence to suggest that they are paid less just because they are majority female. In the US, there are over 500,000 dishwashers, 81% of which are male, and their median earnings are a whopping $22,210 a year. Do they get paid so poorly because it's male dominated? Now, I couldn't find comparable data in Australia, but I did find that a kitchen hand earned approximately 20% less than a childcare worker. What can we chalk that up to? The average woman working in the most feminised industries such as healthcare, social assistance and education is paid around $30,000 less than the average man working in the most male-dominated industries such as mining and construction. Now let's set aside that we don't know how those calculations were made, whether proper controls were done for hours worked and other factors, and point out some obvious differences in these types of jobs that may account for some of the disparity. Could it be that people working in mining and construction are paid more because that type of labour is in more demand? That is, it's harder to find people willing to do it. It's more physically taxing, it's more dangerous, and it doesn't take place in air-conditioned offices and rooms. How many women have died as a result of playing Lego with a 3-year-old in an air-conditioned classroom? Just a thought. So just to recap, the goalposts have shifted once again. Advocates have moved from arguing about equal pay for equal work because they know there's no evidence women get paid less for the same work, and are now arguing for pay rises for female-dominated work on nothing more than asserted truths about female-dominated work being valued less. And so the Labor Party is using statistics that don't account for any factors that might explain why women earn less than men to justify paying women-dominated industries more without any evidence that those industries are paid less just because they're female-dominated. Let's just call it what it is: socialism, but for women only. Now, if the government had any credibility on this issue, they would call out this overtly sexist policy. But since they're completely useless, we get this clown show instead.
I welcome the fact that the Labor Party finally have started focusing on women's economic security. And they've got a lot of catching up to do because under the previous Labor government, the gender pay gap increased up to 17.2%. And full-time employment for women was falling. We have seen under our government the gender pay gap come down to 14.5% and more women in full-time work than ever before. In fact, more women in work than ever before.
Now, everything she said was factually accurate, but who cares if the gender pay gap is lower under the Liberal Party, as demonstrated multiple times? This is an irrelevant statistic that doesn't tell you anything about gender pay disparities in the workplace. All you're doing is legitimising the pay gap as an issue, which it isn't. it's a non-problem. And I'm sure there are even some Labor Party members that know this. But of course, from a political standpoint, it's the perfect emotional tugging at the heartstrings issue. We're supporting the poor, disenfranchised women that are being systematically ripped off in the workplace just because they're women by their unscrupulous sexist employers. The fact that none of this is true doesn't matter if you're ignorant of the issues. It sounds emotionally compelling. Now, to finish off this video, I'm going to leave you with another segment of Bill Shorten, this time demonstrating how he really feels about women. And I'll see you next time.
I want every girl to have the same chance as every boy in Australia.